Episode 2 of my podcast, where I talk women's basketball, cultural and political events that have happened recently, but also things that have happened historically that affect where we are today in society. My name is Laya Hartman, and this is my podcast, Laya on the Line. So I wanted to start today with a little story, a little bit about me. When I was a junior in college at Northwestern, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was playing basketball all the time, and we were provided a lot of resources, so I wasn't necessarily thinking, what are my next steps going to be in life? So my junior year, I was made aware of a grant at Northwestern called the Capitalism Award, which was an award that was given to 5 student athletes. And you got to, essentially, they gave you money, like a grant, and you got to do whatever you wanted. So people wanted to become coaches, if they wanted to, do whatever. They could shadow, they could spend it, money for an internship, if they needed living expenses. You could basically do whatever you wanted with the money. And it was the night before the application was due. And I had no idea what I was going to pitch. I was like, I couldn't even tell you. And I called my dad, and I asked him, I said, Dad, there's this grant that some people at Northwestern want me to apply for. I have no idea what I want to say that I'm going to do with the money. I don't know what I'm aiming for here, but what do you think? Like, what do you think I should do? And he said, well, Leia, why don't you make a story on a girls basketball player in Chicago? And I thought to myself, yeah, I could do that. Like, a story on a girls basketball player, like, totally. Like, I'm a basketball player. I know a lot about basketball. I play. I could tell this story using a camera. And the thing is that at the time, I didn't even think of it as journalism. I didn't even know it was journalism. I didn't think of it as filmmaking necessarily. I just thought, I'm telling this story. Not a documentary. All the things that it is, I wasn't thinking that. I was just thinking, me, basketball, girl, basketball, story. And that was how this all started. I had no awareness that I would be entering the sports media world years later. Didn't even put 2 and 2. This was not a planned thing, is what I'm trying to say. It was very sporadic how this all happened. And so I took my dad's advice, and I said, that's what I wrote my proposal. I'm going to make a story, film a story on a young girls basketball player in Chicago. And I ended up getting connected with a very successful documentary filmmaker at Northwestern, Marco Williams, who tells the stories of Black Americans in America on PBS. And he's still my mentor to this day. And that became the connection between Northwestern and NYU, was this professor who used to teach at NYU's film school. So fast forward, and I ended up going to New York instead of playing professional basketball to pursue this idea that I had of what I could do with a camera and stories. I land in New York, I land at NYU, and in the span of a few days, a few months, I'm now becoming, after years of being the interviewee as a player, I am now the interviewer. And I am not interviewing athletes. This has nothing to do with sports. This is all humanitarian, politically motivated pieces that I'm working on in all over New York City, in the Bronx, Harlem, Queens, Manhattan, with all different types of people. I was in situations that I never would have expected to be in 1 year prior, telling stories on environmental justice, just doing work that felt out of my comfort zone a little bit. And I ended up really liking this humanitarian style work that I did. I became very empathetic with my subjects and felt very affected by their stories. And in this way, this type of work that I did, initially, it drove me away from sports journalism, because I thought to myself, how uninteresting is it to really analyze me, even as a player, my performance one night to the next? Like, who even really cares? Like, why is that a big deal? Like, I didn't really even care when I played. Like, it didn't matter to me. And it just didn't feel like something that I thought, compared to the humanitarian work that I started doing in New York, that sports had any close, like sports was not at all close to what I felt like I was doing. And so initially I was very opposed to talking about sports, doing anything with sports. I was like, this stuff is like so uninteresting, snooze fest. Sports were a snooze fest. Like, I was like, I'm not doing the sports stuff. Like, 5 for 5 Sunday night, 1 for 5 Wednesday night, who cares? Like, I don't even care. Like, why is this interesting to talk about? Why is it interesting to read about? I don't care to consume it. That was what I thought. And I thought, the game was not interesting at all. It became disinteresting to me. The game of basketball itself. I was way more interested in the human stories surrounding the sport. And the sport became like a catalyst for telling the human story. And this is essentially the way that I started to think. And you might wonder, well, why am I like doing a sports podcast right now if I was like so disinterested in sports? Well, I'm going to tell you what happened. What happened was I filmed my thesis. And my thesis was a story about 2 female skateboarders in Detroit, Michigan. And I realized that it's not sports that were the issue. It was my perception of how limited the media and storytelling surrounding sports can be. So I think my grievance with sports media, sports storytelling, journalism, is more with the media than the sport. It really, 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 I felt it deeply, where I was like, I don't agree with this stuff. And like, as a player, as a former college player, current seeking overseas player, I can say that, because I know what it's like to be on both sides now, to talk about a player and to be talked about. And I don't find a lot of it productive. That's what I'll say. So I saw an issue that I wanted to fix, address, do differently. And so that is kind of with this podcast, along with what I want to do in film in the future. Those are like issues that I want to address and solve, essentially, with my own work, and hopefully, expanding upon this and other things in the future, for what I want to put out into the world. Okay, so just to start off with some recent news, things that have been happening in the WNBA. So the WNBA is overlooking women for coaching jobs, head coaching positions. So recently there have been 3 teams that have gotten new head coaches, the Seattle Storm, a new team, the Portland Fire, and the Dallas Wings. 2 of the 3 new head coaches are men. And it has been kind of a trend recently that a lot of new coaches that are being hired are coming from the NBA. Now, we know that there aren't a ton of women coaches in the NBA, and so it kind of is fair to bring up the question, are women getting a fair shot at these positions, at these head coaching positions? What are the criteria that they're looking at? What qualifications are they using? They, meaning the people that are hiring these coaches. What are the qualifications and things that they're looking for in a successful coach? And are those areas that a lot of women are occupying those spaces already, if that makes sense? So yeah, I really am interested to see what happens with these new head coaches. It's not a knock on them as coaches. Like, I'm sure they have amazing records and are amazing people, these men that they're hiring, but when most of the coaches now in the WNBA are men, it is fair to ask, like, why that is, and what criteria they're looking at, and if women are actually getting a fair shot at these positions. For me as a basketball player, and I'm sure any college basketball player as well has experienced this or maybe even thought about this, it kind of comes back to the idea that I was talking about earlier about the media and journalism and how it presents athletes. But right now I want to talk about youth athletes, so K through 12, mainly middle school, high school. And the claim that I'm making right now is that youth athletes should not be sensationalized, and this happens more on the men's side than the women's. When I think of this, I automatically think of someone like Emoni Bates from Detroit, Michigan. I'm 90% sure we were in the same class. If not, he might have been like 1 year removed. I'm from Lansing, he's from Detroit. I also think of people like Bronny James, son of LeBron James, that had an effect on how he was seen in the media through high school, middle school. Same thing with like Zion Williams. A few female players, Zaya Cook, Haley Van Lith, both people, women's players that I felt like had a skewed-ish perception in the media in middle school, high school. And it's just kind of interesting, I think, to look at how this has an effect on players, and if it has an effect on players later in their career. I know that Haley Van Lith has been very publicly outspoken about her mental health challenges with playing basketball and just the pressure that she faces. And I wonder, just theorizing, if that has anything to do with how she was perceived at such a young age, because that doesn't happen to everyone. And I do think also that a bit of this has to do with where you're from. So, for example, someone like Emoni Bates from Detroit. Okay, Detroit's not a city like New York. It's not a city like Chicago, like LA. It's smaller. It's much smaller. And so I think, it's small, but it's big enough that there's enough resources. I mean, there's an NBA team in Detroit. Like it's not tiny. It's not a small town, but it's small enough that, or it's big enough that there's enough resources there to really sensationalize and bring to life him and his potential. I remember at the time people saying things like, he's the next Kevin Durant, he's all these things, he should go here, he's going to be this draft pick. They were sensationalizing his potential. These players in these mid-level cities that are super good, that are sensationalized to the masses and kind of based on their potential. And I think that two things that I think could solve these issues. And just to clarify, I think that sensationalizing players is okay. I think it's a good thing to do, actually. I'm not saying that's the bad part. I think the bad part is specific towards youth, because I don't think in youth sports, even in high school, there's enough, structurally, there's enough put in place to elevate players. So you can win, best in state, like Miss Michigan, Mr. Michigan. You can get Gatorade Player of the Year. You can win a state championship. But those benchmarks are not the same. They're not judged in the same way, and they don't hold as much weight as a college championship. A college, Division I Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, totally different. So I think the benchmarks are different, which creates a different aspect of sensationalizing, which is valid in college and the pros. I don't think it's valid to say that for youth based on their potential and what they could do later on. Something that I also think would be helpful for the media and journalism to look at when thinking about how to talk about and how to platform youth athletes are some TikTokers that I've seen recently. So for example, Road to D1, Road to D3, and there's a Road to the WNBA, which are all individually made platforms on TikTok by players themselves who aspire to that thing. So it's a high school kid that wants to play D1 basketball, wants to play D3 basketball, wants to go to the WNBA. And I think that framing these athletes as like the process is being sensationalized, not their performance as youth, is much more ethical and benefits them a lot more. And to me, honestly, it's quite a bit more interesting than, you know, they're going to be the next KD, they're going to go top 5 draft pick. Like, what are we really talking about here? The bulk of this episode is going to be talking about politics in sports. So it is impossible to disconnect politics from sports. And I'm going to give you an example, probably the most profound example that I could find, that I could tell you is my example. So if you're a new fan of the WNBA, you might have heard of this, you might not have heard of this, but this story is one of the most impactful things that has ever happened in sports, I would argue. And it happened in 2020 with the WNBA. So I'm going to tell you what happened. So in the summer of 2020, as we know, the country, America, was in the middle of a reckoning over racial injustice, following the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many other Black Americans. And the WNBA, a league made up of mostly Black women, decided to take a stand, along with many people, to fight this injustice. So the league launched a social justice council, and the players started wearing Black Lives Matter shirts, warm-ups that said "say her name," and they did this before every game and were very outspoken about their stance on this issue. But not everyone in the league, meaning not just, I'm talking the administrative side, the leadership side, not everyone in the league supported this direction, including the Atlanta Dreams team owner, Kelly Loeffler. All right. So that summer, Kelly Loeffler, a U.S. senator from Georgia and co-owner of the Atlanta Dream, publicly criticized the WNBA's embrace of this social justice movement. She sent a letter to the WNBA commissioner, Kathy Engelbert, saying the league's political messaging was divisive and that sports should not be about politics, sports should be about unity, not politics. So at the time, Loeffler was also running for re-election in Georgia's special Senate race, and her comments immediately caused outrage across the league. Players around the WNBA, including the Players Union, Sue Bird, Nneka Agbumike, Natasha Cloud, spoke out. But the loudest voices came from the Atlanta Dream themselves, the team which she co-owned. The Dream's players decided they weren't going to stay silent. They wanted to respond, not just with a statement, but with something way more powerful. Loeffler said she didn't want politics in sports, so what did the Atlanta Dream do? They brought politics onto the court, literally. They started wearing black t-shirts that said, "Vote Warnock." Now, who is Warnock? Raphael Warnock was one of Loeffler's opponents in the Senate race. He's a pastor from Ebenezer Baptist Church, the same church where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. Before the players spoke up, Warnock was polling at just 9% in the race. So this was a long shot. Little name recognition, little funding, and running against an incumbent senator who was also one of the wealthiest members of Congress. So what are his chances? He's not winning at this point. But everything changed on August 4th, 2020. Everything changed. That night, the Dream players walked into the court wearing the Vote Warnock shirts very boldly. And this image, there was an image taken and a story written, and it went viral. Within hours, it was trending on Twitter. The hashtag Vote Warnock gained millions of impressions. In just 2 days, Warnock's campaign raised $183,000 for more than 3,500 new donors, the majority saying they'd heard about him through the WNBA in this viral photo and the story that's now trending. His Google searches spiked more than 400%, and major outlets like CNN, ESPN, and the New York Times ran stories on the movement. By September, Warnock's polling numbers had climbed from 9% to nearly 30%, making him the leading Democratic challenger. And when the November election came around, neither candidate reached 50%, forcing a runoff election in January 2021. That race became one of the most watched political events in the country because it would determine the control of the U.S. Senate. On January 5th, 2021, Raphael Warnock defeated Kelly Loeffler with 51% of the vote. His win made him the first black U.S. senator in Georgia's history, and along with fellow Democrat Jon Ossoff's history over David Perdue, flipped the Senate into Democratic control, creating a 50-50 split with Vice President Kamala Harris as the tie-breaking vote. That shift in power directly affected what was happening in Washington over the next 2 years, from COVID relief packages to judicial nominations to major infrastructure funding, and it all tied back to this core group of WNBA players on the Atlanta Dream who took a stand and said, nope, we're not allowing this injustice to happen, and we're going to speak out about it, not just with a statement, but with action. So when people say, sports and politics can't and shouldn't mix, well, they obviously do, and it can have very, very, very profound effects. So that's a very recent example of how profound sports and politics can mix and can be beneficial in fighting for a specific cause. Now, I think that the power that athletes hold in the political space is immense, and I think it's underutilized. But I think that there's not necessarily a framework in sports or in sports culture for this to really come to life. And I'm going to explain to you later on why this is. There's a very specific reason, and it traces back years and years and years. So to kind of set this up, I'm mostly right now going to be talking now about Black athletes, Black American athletes, since they make up a majority of pro sports, especially in the WNBA, and how the framework around how we talk about Black athletes has changed over the years. So generally speaking, are sports a path to empowerment for Black athletes or a system that exploits them to uphold existing power structures? Are these people profiting and becoming role models, or are they victims of this system which is inherently kind of controlling and suppressing them to confine them to certain beliefs and shape them into what is socially acceptable? Generally speaking, these two broad perspectives exist and line with the contested racial terrain metaphor alluded to above. One side suggests that sports are a premier way for Black people to achieve social and upward mobility economically, positioning Black athletes as ideal role models. And the other side argues that sports are inherently exploitative of and discriminate Black people and reinforce power structures in society, making Black athletes mere pawns in the game. I don't really think, I don't have an answer for this. I think it's something worth theorizing. I think if I were to put an answer to the question, I would say it's a mix of both, where I do think that there is a lot of upward mobility that Black people can make in sports, and I think that the role model aspect obviously is a big thing, but at the same time, there's definitely an element of an exploitative nature within the power structure of sports, professional sports, college sports, all of it. Let's talk a little bit now about history and where this all kind of comes from in relation to Black athletes. So when we think of the first Black athletes, I think a lot of people, including myself, we think of Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, John Taylor, the big names that, there's documentaries on them, there's all this published work on them. But I don't think a lot of people know that there's an origin story to this origin story, and that comes from slavery. And the first black athletes in America aren't actually these people. They were athletes on plantations. And if we break it down, we can see that there's actually a lot of parallels between that system and the current system that is upheld in professional athletics. Enslaved men were often forced to compete in fighting matches or races for the entertainment and profit of white slave owners. They were mostly boxers and jockeys. So jockeys is horse racing. So they would race, they would fight, and oftentimes they would fight for money, not personal money, but the slave owners would bet on who would win. So they would match people up, have them fight, have them race, and then profit off of it. There were some instances as well where slaves could fight for their freedom. So if they won certain matches, they would benefit from that. But inherently, this is all exploitative of these athletes. And after slavery ended, sports actually became one of the few spaces where black people could earn money and gain visibility, front-facing visibility. But racism still controlled who got to compete where and against whom. They couldn't compete against white people. It was all black versus black. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, some of the earliest professional black athletes were boxers and jockeys. Black jockeys dominated the first Kentucky Derbies. In fact, 15 of the first 28 winners were black. But as the sport became more profitable, white owners and riders pushed them out through violence and exclusion. And this kind of made me think too, I'm not exactly sure the history on this, but it kind of made me think, the word cowboy, because, the reason that black people at the time became jockeys was because of working the plantation. Some of them were tasked to work with horses, and so they became the most knowledgeable people in the South to work with horses. They knew everything about horses, way more than the white people. So, when it came to riding horses and racing them, they were completely dominant because they were around them all day. They worked with horses on the plantations. So this kind of made me think the word cowboy, if that has any relation to this time period of how they would call black people boy, cowboy, if that had to do with black people being the first cowboys. I don't know. That's not a fact. It was something that came to my head that might be true, might not be true. But yeah, so black boxers at the same time faced the same thing. Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, became world famous in 1908. But he was hated in America for beating white fighters and defying racist norms. So because of this, many black boxers had to fight overseas in places like France, Australia, just to earn a living or be treated with basic respect. The same was true for Major Taylor. He was a world champion cyclist, originally from Indiana. And in the United States, he was banned from many races, attacked by white competitors, and denied endorsements. So he too went to Europe and Australia, where crowds usually cheered for him, not against him. And these early athletes, they weren't just competing in sports, they were competing against a system built to keep them out. So this is kind of, the origins. This is the very, 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 very first black athletes on plantations, forced to fight each other and to face discrimination. They are, after the Emancipation Proclamation, they are escaping to Europe to compete and not be discriminated to the same level. And if we fast forward 2025 to, for example, the WNBA. What's going on in the WNBA? Players are playing here, and very talented players, the best players in the world, and they are going to Europe as well. Why are they going to Europe? To get paid. So are we tracking here? Are we tracking what's going on? So it's, the parallels, they're leaving to do something similar but for different reasons. It's not to escape racial discrimination in the WNBA, but it's to escape a monetary discrimination. They are escaping economic inequality and institutional neglect. So yes, it is fair to call this system that was created through slavery a different kind of discrimination now, but it uses the same framework. The same thing that slaves, it's the same thing. There's a lot of historians and in history, a lot of people that study material like this, they are able to draw very direct conclusions between taking something that's happened years ago and seeing that the framework is still similar today. I mean, we see that happening all the time, not just when it comes to women's basketball or sports in general. That there's systemic racism that exists in the government, it exists in the police force, it exists in many, many, many spaces that were systemically built years ago based on these principles of oppression and racism, and how that can transform, but those same values can be carried through to today. So when we look at the structure of sports, whereas its very original origin, it's in slavery. It's in players, black players being used to perform for white crowds. When black people actually first started playing sports after the Emancipation Proclamation, it was actually looked at as something that was not advisable to do because you are playing right into what white people want you to do. You're entertaining them. You're playing for an all-white crowd. You're appealing to white people. It was not looked at as like a very role model, aspirational thing to do. You were looked at as, why are you trying to appease the white man and perform for them and do all these things that they find entertaining and they're making money off of you? That was how it was perceived in the beginning. And obviously that's not true today, but when you look back and you start to draw conclusions between connections between things, how did certain things that exist today get to be that way? There's actual really specific answers to a lot of those questions. It didn't just come out of nowhere. So there's a lot of other examples of how sports and politics are intertwined. They cannot be separated. So sports were one of the first battlegrounds for racial inequality in America. I'm going to just read a list of some things that have happened in history. So back in the early 1900s, black boxers weren't even allowed to fight for heavyweight championships. So this is the national championship, the top of the top. Black boxers couldn't do it. White champions refused to face them because that title wasn't just about boxing, it was about protecting white supremacy. The idea of a black man holding that title scared people. It would flip their whole idea on who held the power. So we see sports here in history not being just about the sport, but it's about the world. It's about how are my people perceived in this way? And how could we keep people that look like me, or my people, quote unquote, from looking bad? And in turn, they looked at sports as holding power, not just for the sport itself, but transcending the sport, transcending the arena, and affecting the political landscape around us. And a hierarchy, essentially, of who is able to do what and who controls who. Sports affected this deeply, obviously, in American history. So Jack Johnson, a black boxer in 1908, is finally given an opportunity to fight a white boxer. The white boxer was paid a bunch of money to do this, and they said, all right, we're going to have these two face each other. And Johnson destroyed him. But instead of celebrating, white America panicked. And they started looking for a so-called, what they called it at the time, was a great white hope, someone who could beat Johnson and, quote, restore order. When former champ Jim Jeffries came out of retirement to fight him on July 4th, 1910, this wasn't just a match. This was a national statement. Okay, this wasn't just about the boxing match. This was about race as it was perceived in America at the time. Who holds the power? Who is climbing in rank? The fight was called the fight of the century. On Independence Day, of all days, the whole country was watching to see if America's racial hierarchy would hold. And Johnson won again. And that victory sparked riots across the whole country as white mobs attacked black communities who were celebrating Johnson's success. And it shows, that this was never just about sports, but this was a battlefield for power, pride, and race in America. President Dwight D. Eisenhower allegedly once proclaimed that the true mission of American sports is to prepare young people for war, political. Attorney General Robert Kennedy in 1964 directly invoked the political nature of the Olympics when he said that, quote, part of a nation's prestige in the Cold War is won in the Olympic Games, as, quote, nations use the scoreboard of sports as a visible measuring stick to prove their superiority. Presidents throw ceremonial first pitches in baseball games, and they apparently strike deals on the golf course all the time. National championship winning teams receive invitations to the White House. This has been happening for a while as well. There's a lot of mixing here between, people with power, white people, and politics. And then the real question is, why are they so mad when black people then stand up and say something they believe in that's politically motivated? And then you're told, shut up and dribble. It is complete hypocrisy and it makes no sense. So sports are sold as being apolitical, and proof that hard work beats inequality. But in reality, they show exactly how inequality still exists. People love to say that, if you work hard, if you just work hard, you can make it, right? In sports, if you just dribble enough, you get your ball handling skills tight enough, you can make it to the NBA. You could do all these things. And it kind of positions it as an even playing field where talent wins. But, in reality, this is not the whole truth. And I think that whole idea of it being even playing field kind of mimics capitalism and this free market that we live in America, where, people say, well, you're in America, you can do what you want, your own prosperity is up to you, your own wealth, your own success is up to you solely. It's an individual responsibility. This is a really common way that people think, and it's interesting that it's also intertwined in sports, that we see this same system kind of upheld in certain ways. But this is actually, in my opinion, a really defeating way to think when we consider how many inequalities there are in America in general and in sports as well, in terms of opportunities, positioning, where you're from, the list could go on. So for example, when black athletes sometimes succeed, for example, LeBron James, people tend to, point to them and be like, well, the American system's fair, anyone can do it. Look, he did it. Like, from Ohio, didn't grow up with the most money in the world, but look at where he is now. Anyone can do it. So, that's a politically motivated statement. But then at the same time, when someone like LeBron James comes out and says something political that, he's engaging with, it's not okay. And that kind of, again, shows who really has the power in the situation. It's never the athlete. And, these players represent a system which they can't then turn around and critique, which is an issue. So I'm going to quote here from a dissertation called No More Sticking to Sports, Black Athlete Activism and Its Political Consequences by Sebastian Mayer. Quote, especially when considering race, sports is neither apolitical nor does it solely exist for the purpose of entertainment. The defining cultural power of sports exists in the reflection and revealing of broader social and political consultations, offering a way to understand contemporary political and societal issues in the field of play. Sports serve a dual role of both reproducing racial discrimination and resisting the status of white privilege. Yeah, so I think that kind of speaks for itself there. I'll leave that one there. All right, and my last claim of the day, sports amplify politics. So this is essentially arguing that not only are they inseparable, but sports bring this to the next level, bring politics to the next level. It has the power to do that. So athletes, they're entertainers today. They're not just players. I mean, they're all over, the media, TV, social media, you name it. And they're some of the most powerful celebrities on this planet, actually. 22 of the 25 most watched TV broadcasts in the U.S. history are sporting events. That's 22 out of the 25. So this means, when athletes speak, millions of people are already listening. They know who you are. Their fame isn't just about entertainment, but it is about influence, because sports are live, they're unscripted, they're emotional, and fans experience the highs and the lows right alongside their favorite players. So this creates a shared emotion, which builds deep loyalty. Sometimes almost like a cult-like following that we see with teams like the Indiana Fever. Fans don't just watch athletes, but they identify with them, their values, what they stand for, what they say, and how they say it. It's all taken in as information. And this is what makes athletes different from movie stars or influencers. They don't just represent themselves, but they represent this, an extent of struggle, teamwork, victory, and resilience in real time. You don't know what's going to happen. It's live. It's exciting. And for Black athletes, that influence carries even more weight. They've become leaders in their communities, not just in sports, but in politics and culture. When they speak out, it's not random celebrity activism, it's political leadership, and it should be seen as so. So when we talk about athletes and their voices, we have to start seeing them not just as entertainers, but as powerful political figures who shape how people think, feel, and act, because that's how much power they hold in what they say. And I guess throughout this, I kept saying they. When I say they, I'm referring to professional athletes, which then I'm also am I included in this? Because I'm I am trying to play overseas, and I did play in college. So I guess to an extent as well, my positioning holds a degree of this weight, where if I do feel in a way, if I do say something specifically about the WNBA, it does hold a little bit of a different weight. Maybe not because people know, I don't have a name that people will be Candace Parker, but I think the perspective is still there. The perspective of I'm coming at this from the athlete perspective, because that's what how I came to perceive, sports was as an athlete, not as a consumer of sports, but as an active participant in the game itself. And I think also it's interesting to think about podcasters now like Sue Bird and Candace Parker, who talk about these things that happen in women's basketball, trending headlines, interviewing players, and, how tied they are to that element of the game, while also being able to look back and reflect and ask interesting questions, maybe questions that they've never thought about as a player, but things that they're now kind of churning through and trying to understand. That's kind of how I feel a little bit doing stuff like this. But this episode was a little different than the last one. It was definitely a bit harder to prepare for. I read a 200-page dissertation on some of this stuff. I consumed a lot of information, read a lot, watched a lot. But yeah, I guess also just, text me if you're one of my friends that's watching this. Text me what you think. I'm just kind of curious, what feedback is in terms of the topics more so. And I decided to change this and add claims just because I thought it could be a little bit more engaging. Because I do think it is productive to have your own thoughts. So I'm saying what I think, but what do you think? And if I frame something as a claim that I'm arguing, then you could agree or disagree. And I think that, I don't know, I like how that's engaging. And it frames it as more of a debate, even though I'm not actively debating someone. But yeah, I guess just let me know what you think. I'm excited for Unrivaled to start in the women's basketball world in January, and until then, we'll see how this CBA negotiation ends up the next few days, hopefully, fingers crossed. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.